No signs of an agreement between European leaders amid mammoth talks to decide on how an unprecedented €1.85 trillion will be shared between them, this weekend focusing mainly on the €750 billion coronavirus rescue package. Fears grow that a second COVID-19 wave is already sweeping across France. The latest figures showing that a further 14 people have died in the past 24 hours. And in Brazil, the second worst affected country by COVID-19 in the world, cases finally appear to be reaching a plateau. The World Health Organization urges the government to now take swift action to curb the spread even further. For those of you just joining us, welcome to the France 24 newsroom in Paris. I'm Alexander Orcott. Now, the leaders of the 27 EU member states walked out of talks after midnight without reaching a consensus on a proposed €750 billion coronavirus recovery fund. After 13 hours, the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte rejected a compromise proposal put forward by the chairman of EU leaders late in the day, prompting Charles Michel to call time on the talks that are set to proceed for a second and supposedly final day on Saturday. The Netherlands is one of the so-called frugal four, along with Austria, Denmark and Sweden, that want more conditions to be put on countries that are receiving funds.
To conquer this crisis, we do need solidarity from the countries that are able to free up more in their budget for countries that are less able to. But on the other hand, I would say to those countries, do everything you can so that you're able to resolve future crises. That means reforms in the job market and in pensions.
Well, of course, France 24's Europe editor Catherine Nicholson has been following very closely these talks for us with all of its twists and turns. She earlier explained the major roadblocks standing in the way of reaching a deal.
One biggie is rebates. We know the UK famously had a budget rebate from the European Union. Now, the current budget proposal being put forward at this summit would include budget rebates for the frugal four that I just mentioned, plus Germany. Now, they're all net contributors to the EU coffers, but so are France, Italy, Ireland and Finland, who are not being put forward for rebates. Now, some states are saying that no member state should get a rebate from the EU budget, for example, Poland. That leads me on to another big point, conditions being attached to the money that's handed out. One condition that's being proposed is a link between states respecting rule of law, which is part of the EU treaties that they must respect rule of law, and getting EU money. So Poland and Hungary very much in the firing line on this. Both of those countries currently facing EU sanctions for degradations of rule of law in their countries. And their leaders are threatening to veto any such conditionality proposal. So another thorny issue to hash out there. One more biggie to flag up, the way that the EU Commission is actually going to calculate how much money gets handed out to each different state. There's been pushback from various states on the calculations that have been put forward, whether they accurately measure how much economic damage has been done specifically by the pandemic itself, because some of the figures that are being put forward, the states that are pushing back are saying, you know, you're looking too far in the past on the unemployment figures, that kind of thing. We need to focus this on the specific period of the pandemic. So we've got the Netherlands, Denmark, Austria, Belgium, Ireland, Lithuania, Hungary. It's quite a big list. It's potentially growing. In fact, as we speak, they're among the states that have hit out at this. So, yes, indications are that we could be waiting at least until Saturday evening or perhaps even later for some kind of conclusion, because what we've been told by European Union officials is that there isn't going to be an agreement until everything is agreed.
And as mentioned earlier, those talks set to continue throughout this Saturday. Moving on now, and here in France, face masks will become mandatory in all indoor public spaces from next week. The government brought forward the measure that had already been planned to begin in the beginning of August due to a worrying rise in coronavirus cases in several regions. Well, this Friday, an additional 14 people have been killed by the pandemic, taking the total here in France to 30,152. Selena Sykes tells us more.
This medical lab in Brittany in northern France has seen the number of COVID-19 tests multiplied by 4 in just a few days.
My mother is 93 years old. I don't want to bring any germs back home.
The wearing of face masks at the local market and indoor public spaces in this town has been mandatory since Friday morning. Locals and tourists aren't worried for now, but are remaining vigilant.
I'm not paranoid, but we're protecting ourselves by wearing masks and washing our hands regularly. I think that if everyone does that, we can minimize the risk, but the virus will continue to circulate. That's obvious.
According to the latest data published by the French government, Brittany is a red zone, with the reproduction rate of the virus standing at 2.6, meaning one person infects on average 2.5 people. A figure close to the national contamination rate at the height of the coronavirus crisis. According to certain epidemiologists, there is no need to panic yet, because the figures are constantly changing.
2.6 is a point estimation, which will most probably change in the coming days with the increase in tests and the next round of results for Brittany.
Brittany is not the only region in France that has seen an increase in cases. Nouvelle-Aquitaine, Pays de la Loire and Sud-PACA are also on high alert.
Barcelona's almost 4 million residents have been urged to stay at home unless absolutely necessary. The Catalan government trying to curb the spread of COVID-19 as the city saw a recent surge in cases. Karis Garland tells us more.
Residents of Barcelona and its suburbs aren't being sent into a full lockdown just yet, but the Catalan government said everyone must act responsibly in order to avoid further spread of COVID-19.
Ens veiem obligats a fer una passa enrere per tal d'aconseguir no haver de tornar les pròximes setmanes a la situació de confinament total de la població. Els ciutadans de tots aquests municipis s'han de quedar a casa sempre que no sigui imprescindible sortir. Aquesta és la petició que us fem.
The stay-at-home call comes as Barcelona recorded a near tripling of coronavirus cases in the past week. On Friday, the regional government also announced a ban on gatherings of more than 10 people and the closure of cinemas, theatres and nightclubs. Restaurants can still open, but at half their usual capacity. For most Barcelona residents, they're measures that need to be taken.
Creo que las medidas son acertadas. Ahora falta que la gente colabore, porque si la gente coopera, creo que se puede detener el virus.
Afecta a todo el mundo, de eso de quedarse encerrado a nadie le gusta, ¿no? Pero la salud, la vida es lo primordial, ¿no? Lo principal.
West of Barcelona, Lerida and surrounding towns were placed under lockdown Wednesday, following a standoff between the regional government and judicial authorities. Many regions, meanwhile, have made it mandatory to wear face masks in public.
Meanwhile, as coronavirus cases soar across the United States, Donald Trump has said he will not consider making masks mandatory. This has worried American parents are wondering whether it'll be safe to send their children to school in a few short weeks. The US president has further made clear his view that the schools should reopen, but in many areas, local officials disagree. In California, for example, the largest school district will continue distance learning instead. Catherine Viet has more.
As the start of the school year looms, the debate over in-person classes or online instruction has grown more urgent. With many states in the midst of a worsening coronavirus outbreak, parents are worried about their children's safety. In Florida, the hardest-hit state, the governor is requiring all schools to reopen, pushing some parents to opt for homeschooling.
The school start date is less than 30 days away, and I don't feel that there's a very great plan in place that makes me feel comfortable enough to send my baby to school and then return back to our family dynamic.
Teachers, too, are concerned about returning to the classroom and worried about a lack of clear guidelines from the federal government.
So many unanswered questions about what happens. When we step on campus, we know the protocols for everything. We know the protocols for a fire drill. We know the protocols for code yellow, the code white, or code red. What's the COVID protocol? Who's responsible for that?
Adding to all the confusion is President Donald Trump's adamant demand that all schools reopen in the fall. On social media and in interviews, the president has stuck to his guns, even threatening to cut off federal funding if schools continue with online classes.
Schools should be opened. Schools should be opened. If kids want to go to school, you're losing a lot of lives by keeping things closed.
Meanwhile, the governor of California has just issued new guidelines for when schools can start reopening classrooms. They must be in a county that stayed off the state's monitoring list for at least 14 days.
Now, further south in South America, it's one of the last continents to be gripped by the coronavirus crisis. The response to the pandemic has varied from country to country, though many are now beginning to ease restrictions. In Brazil, where infections appear to have reached a plateau, the World Health Organization is urging the government to now seize on the moment to curb the spread even further.
With 77,000 deaths and more than 2 million reported coronavirus cases, Brazil is the second worst hit country in the world. But the South American nation has now reached a plateau, according to the World Health Organization, meaning the number of new cases is not rising above 45,000 per day. The organization still warns that Brazil is far from out of the woods, urging the government to seize the opportunity to get the outbreak under control.
There's an opportunity, once those numbers have stabilised, to drive transmission downwards. And I think that opportunity exists now for Brazil to do that. But it is going to take a very sustained, concerted action.
In neighbouring Argentina, the government is gradually loosening lockdown measures in the capital that have lasted for almost 4 months. Non-essential shops, beauty salons and some professional services will be able to reopen on Monday. Outdoor sports activities will also be allowed, though schools remain closed.
Entre el 18 de julio y el 2 de agosto vamos a ir tratando de volver a la vida habitual en este nuevo mundo, en este mundo diferente que nos exige cuidados diferentes. Y lo vamos a hacer escalonadamente.
Meanwhile, domestic flights have resumed in Peru, though they are running at 5% of their usual capacity at Lima's airport. Colombia, too, is slowly lifting restrictions, with certain parts of the economy and some regions starting to reopen. All lockdown measures are due to end at the beginning of August. On Thursday, the country registered a record 8,000 cases in 24 hours. But President Ivan Duque is determined to kickstart the economy, which saw its largest fall on record in April.
Now back to the United States, where a suspect has been taken into custody following the brutal death of a young tech entrepreneur. 33-year-old Fahim Saleh's dismembered body was found by a relative earlier this week inside his luxury Manhattan condo. The police have video footage of him engaged in a physical struggle with someone who was masked and dressed entirely in black as he entered. The person in custody is said to be his personal assistant. Saleh was the chief executive officer of the ride-hailing motorcycle startup called Gokada that began operating in Nigeria 2 years ago. Now, with anti-racism protests springing up all over the world following the death of George Floyd, many countries are pledging to do more to tackle the issue. In Cuba, the socialist government promised to end racism at the start of the revolution 6 decades ago. But as Ellen Gainsford explains, it's far from mission accomplished.
It's a country that sells itself as colourblind. But by acting as if the issue of racism is resolved, has the Cuban government prevented the steps needed to fully eradicate it?
El racismo en Cuba es muy hipócrita por una razón muy sencilla. Es muy fácil decir, yo soy homofóbico, yo soy ateo, pero en Cuba que una persona diga, yo soy racista, eso no lo dicen aunque lo sean.
Today, 40% of the country's lawmakers are people of color, including the president of the Cuban parliament and the vice president. Following the socialist revolution in 1959, Cuba ended racial segregation, and the official line is that systemic racism no longer exists. But many Afro-Cubans say their everyday reality doesn't reflect this.
Es decir, medir el número de negros y mestizos que hay en el parlamento, en el gobierno, etcétera, para demostrar de que el racismo no existe o que es una de las maneras de atajarlo, es una política un tanto equivocada, porque el verdadero racismo está en las calles, está en las condiciones estructurales y económicas endebles que tiene la población negra y mestiza de la isla de Cuba.
A 2019 study shows that 70% of black and mixed-race Cubans don't have access to the internet, compared with 25% of white Cubans. And while 50% of white Cubans have a banking account, only 11% of black Cubans said that they had one. Statistics that show that racial inequality is far from over on the island.
Stay tuned for more updates on France 24.